Christmas! It is now Christmastide, and the 12 days of Christmas have begun. How many Christmases do you think we've seen between us all? 800? 900? 1,000? Even though we know the story, something keeps us coming to church on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day over and over and over again, like a child reading a favorite book. What is it about the story of God's love that makes us want to hear it again and again? What brings you here this morning, the day after Christmas? Out of the million of other things that you could be doing, you are here. Why? During Advent, I was using Scott Erickson's devotional, An Honest Advent. I'll show it to you. And in chapter 14, he made an astute observation about the relationship between a therapist and their client. As a marriage and family therapist, my antenna perked up. In 1965, a documentary film called 3 Approaches to Psychotherapy, 1, 2, and 3 was released. The premise was to have 3 of the big psychotherapist names of the day, Fritz Perls, Gestalt therapy, Albert Ellis, rational emotive therapy, and Carl Rogers, person-centered therapy, each have a session with a real client named Gloria in order to show the world what happens in a therapy session. Now, I am an Adlerian-trained therapist and know that Carl Rogers was influenced by Alfred Adler when Adler was a guest instructor at Rogers University in 1927 and 1928. One of the things that Rogers explained in the film was that the 3 most important questions a therapist should ask themselves when working with a client are, number 1, can I be real in the relationship with the client? The therapist is present to themselves and in the moment with the other person. Number 2, will I find myself prizing this person? Now, Adler would call prizing unconditional positive regard for the other person. And number 3, will I be able to understand the inner world of this individual? This is empathy. I love these questions, and I immediately translated them to our Christian way of being in the world, especially reflected in our baptismal covenant. Number 1, can I be real and authentically myself with God and other people? Number 2, will I seek and serve Christ in the other person? And number 3, can I provide the ministry of presence, being with the person physically, emotionally, and spiritually with the other where they are? Now, thousands of therapists have followed in the footsteps of Carl Rogers, applying his theories to their counseling practice. Billions of Christians over the past 2,000 years follow Jesus, who learned his way of being in relationship with others from God. After all, one of the names we use for Jesus is Wonderful Counselor. It is interesting that God looked at the world, saw the problem was its people turning away from God in sin, and then decided to solve this problem by becoming one of the problems. Our gospel this morning reminds us, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. God became flesh so that we could be in relationship with God and in better relationship with each other. Now, every good therapist knows that the relationship between the client and the therapist is the most healing aspect of treatment. If you do not have rapport and trust, therapy will not work. And this makes sense from a broader perspective because as Christians, we know that God always begins with relationship. God became human to explain how important relationships are. We cannot just have the word, an idea out there somewhere in the heavens, separate from the incarnation, the body walking around without enlivenment of the Spirit. The divine has very cleverly and rightly given us both. Now, some of you might be old enough to remember radio broadcaster Paul Harvey. He once told a Christmas parable called The Man and the Birds. And I want to share it with you because it illustrates this point so beautifully. And he told it like this. You know, the Christmas story, God born a man in a manger and all that, escapes some moderns. Mostly, I think, they seek complex answers to their questions, and this one is utterly simple. So for the cynics and the skeptics and the unconvinced, I submit a modern parable. Now, the man to whom I'm going to introduce you was not a Scrooge. He was a kind, decent, mostly good man, generous to his family, upright in his dealings with other people, but he just didn't believe in all that incarnation stuff which the churches proclaim at Christmas time. It just didn't make sense, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. He just couldn't swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as a man. I'm truly sorry to distress you, he told his wife, but I'm not going with you to church this Christmas Eve. He said he'd feel like a hypocrite, that he'd much rather just stay at home, but that he would wait up for them. So he stayed, and they went to the midnight service. Shortly after the family car drove away, snow began to fall. He went to the window to watch the flurries getting heavier and heavier, and then went back to his fireside chair and began to read his newspaper while listening to the radio. There was soft Christmas music playing, and he had a cup of hot chocolate in hand. Life was good. Minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound. Thud, thud, and then another thud, thud, and then another thud. Sort of a thump or a thud. At first, he thought someone must be throwing snowballs against his living room window. But when he went to the front door to investigate, he found a flock of birds huddled miserably in the snow. They had been caught in the storm and in a desperate search for shelter had tried to fly through his large landscape window. Well, he couldn't let the poor creatures lie there and freeze, so he remembered the barn where his children stabled their pony. That would provide a warm shelter if he could direct the birds to it. Quickly, he put on a coat and galoshes, tramped through the deepening snow to the barn. He opened the doors wide and turned on the light. But the birds did not come in. Then he figured food would entice them, so he hurried back to the house, fetched breadcrumbs, sprinkled them on the snow, making a trail to the yellow, lighted, wide-open door to the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs and continued to flop around helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them. He tried shooing them into the barn by walking around them and waving his arms. Instead, they scattered in every direction except into the warm, lighted barn. It was then that he realized that the birds were afraid of him. To them, he reasoned, I am a strange and terrifying creature. If only I could let them know that they can trust me, that I'm not trying to hurt them, but to help them. But how? Because any move he made tended to frighten them and confuse them. They just would not follow. They would not be led or shooed because they feared him. If only I could be a bird, he thought to himself, and mingle with them and speak their language. Then I could tell them not to be afraid. Then I could show them the way to the safe, warm barn. But I would have to be one of them so they could see and hear and understand. At that moment, the church bells began to ring. The sound reached his ears above the sounds of the wind. He stood there listening to the bells, and from inside he could hear singing on the radio.
Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King.
Listening to the bells pealing, the glad tidings of Christmas, and the voices swelling as they sang the end of the second verse.
Jesus, our Emmanuel, hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King.
Jesus, our Emmanuel, God with us. If only he could be a bird. God became flesh, and the man sank to his knees in the snow. This is what God has done for us at Christmas. God has come to be with us, to know us, to speak our language, to do what we do, so that we can know God, and we can be known by God. And no wonder this is our favorite story that we want to hear year after year. May we carry it with us in our hearts and do the work of Christmas throughout our lives. Amen.